Dave, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here. You have a pretty wild and somewhat shocking to some people hypothesis around LDL and LDL cholesterol. One that, if proven to be true, could have the scientific community rethink the nuances around LDL cholesterol and its link to heart disease. So I'd love to start there. If you wouldn't mind sharing, what is this hypothesis?
Well, cholesterol that is, being picked up in a blood test is often associated with cardiovascular disease. And that's why it's assumed that, generally speaking, the lower you can get it, the better. And the more likely it is that you'll have less heart disease. And what happened to me is I went on a low carb diet. My cholesterol went up substantially. But I have no background in formal research. I'm actually a software engineer and was building platforms in code. But when this happened to me and my cholesterol went up, I had that fear that the cholesterol levels, for as high as they were going to lead me down the road of cardiovascular disease. And spoiler alert, I don't have a straight answer for that just yet. We'll kind of get a chance to go into how we're getting that information. But yes, the hypothesis is the exact scenario I'm describing, where I myself, who tend to be leaner and more metabolically healthy, and saw my cholesterol go up from going on a ketogenic diet and becoming adapted to consuming fat, that actually the higher level of cholesterol may be physiological as opposed to pathological. I know those are two big words, but physiological meaning it may actually be a normal process, that cholesterol is kind of a part of that means by which I'm moving fat around in my body, versus pathological, which is to say that it's going to create an illness. And yes, obviously that's very controversial, because modern medical science would say, no, there's no version of having high levels of LDL cholesterol, particularly the LDL, which is the bad cholesterol, that could be considered healthy.
Talk to us about what are the potential implications if your idea, your hypothesis turns out to be true. How does it have us rethink how we approach this area of a blood marker, which is really connected to, avoiding a downstream effect, which would be heart disease?
Well, certainly it gets us to rethink the current prevailing hypothesis that all versions of high LDL cholesterol are necessarily bad. And I should qualify that this very specific way in which we're studying it, with people going on a ketogenic diet for which it seems to increase under the conditions of being metabolically healthy, that's the one piece we're on right now. So I can't say if we do find people like me and my colleague Nick Norwitz, which I'm sure we'll get to talk about here in a moment, that alone would dispel the entire lipid hypothesis, that, this concept that high LDL is bad no matter what the context. We're looking at the specific context, and in this scenario, it may well be that if this doesn't increase the risk of heart disease, that the thing we are theorizing may be true, that it does have to do more with trafficking. It is important, though, to emphasize that this context isn't just the high levels of LDL cholesterol. You've probably heard of what's often called the good cholesterol, HDL cholesterol. And there's another measurement you get in a lipid panel called triglycerides. Triglycerides are a measure of fat in the blood. That is usually lower in the profile we're looking at. So high LDL cholesterol coupled with high HDL cholesterol and low triglycerides, this triad, these three together, are the triad we're interested in, because the second two, HDL cholesterol being high, triglycerides being low, is typical for somebody who's healthy, particularly metabolically healthy. They tend to be able to handle the fuel inside their body really well. And yes, this is the irony, is that we don't really have a lot of studies on people who are metabolically healthy, but with very high levels of LDL cholesterol, to see how much this does associate with having higher cardiovascular disease when their LDL is high.
It's an important point, because largely when people go on a low carb diet, low carb whole food diet is what we're talking about here. And in some cases, going on a ketogenic diet, which is even a step further, they see that a lot of their blood markers improve. many areas of their health as markers improve. You mentioned a few of them. They noticed that their HDL would go up. They noticed that their triglycerides would come down. But the one area that always had people scratch their head, including myself, would be that if you are otherwise lean and healthy, and you guys have a BMI where you typically say that that number resides, we'll talk about that in a second. If your LDL still goes up, there must be something wrong with this dietary approach. There must be something wrong with this dietary intervention. So the contrast for the audience that's listening is all these incredible things are happening to your blood markers, but something must fundamentally be wrong with your approach, and maybe the ketogenic diet in general or the low carb diet in general, if your LDL is now not only increasing, but in some cases, skyrocketing for some individuals who, again, are healthy and lean individuals. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, actually. And again, without having a lot of research on folks like these already, we're kind of in many ways almost starting from scratch, just in that there really hasn't been a lot of research, particularly in the context of the ketogenic diet.
Now, let's talk about the research that exists, and then we'll get into this pretty crazy experiment that one of your colleagues, Nick Norwitz, did on himself. It's an experiment. It's not, a study. It's trying to prove a point that's there. And it has something to do with Oreo cookies. So stay tuned. You're going to learn all about that. Talk to us why so many people in our audience, they listen to podcasts. They listen to experts that are out there like Peter Attia or whoever it might be, and they've heard that the research on LDL is pretty slam dunk, that there is a lot of data showing the correlation with high LDL and cardiovascular disease. What is the literature that exists out there right now, and how strong is that literature?
Well, certainly somebody who's a traditional lipidologist would say it's extremely strong. There's a 2017 EAS paper, has a graphic. You've probably seen a lot of other people who've ever done any research or just like looked for studies online might have seen, which shows 3 lines of evidence. It shows genetic evidence, which means if you're genetically born with high levels of LDL throughout your life, you tend to be more predisposed to higher association of cardiovascular disease. Interventional studies, so drug trials where they intervene to lower LDL, and those tend to have a lower association of cardiovascular events. And then there's observational, that it tends to be folks who have lower levels of LDL as observed with epidemiological data. They tend to have lower levels of cardiovascular events. But there's kind of a catch here. The catch is virtually all of these data across all of these lines of evidence, they are on populations that either partially or exclusively look at situations with those people who either have some form of acquired disease like metabolic syndrome, or something like in the case with the genetic diseases I just mentioned, which is congenital. In that there's some dysfunction with lipid metabolism, some way in which they don't handle lipids or lipoproteins very well. In other words, it's a broken system. It doesn't quite function properly. And that's kind of important because things like HDL cholesterol, the so-called good cholesterol, is actually intimately connected to LDL cholesterol. They're literally moving a lot of these cholesterol molecules between each other. And we actually go through that with the lipid energy model, which we published, which kind of explains this phenomenon. And that's kind of important because if you're wanting to assess the totality of the evidence, folks like Peter Attia would say, look, the evidence across the board seems to agree. The catch is we have a major confounder that's shared among all of those different lines of evidence with this dysfunction in lipid metabolism. We needed to get a population like the ones we're talking about, the people who have this triad, particularly folks like Nick Norwitz, where their LDL cholesterol is extremely high and their HDL is extremely high and their triglycerides are very low, so that they're metabolically healthy, and who are, as we study them, who are intentionally low to no risk factors otherwise, but seem to have a functional lipid metabolism. So it could be that their LDL is high for a functional metabolic reason. That's kind of important because now we're kind of looking into a new line of evidence that takes away that confounder. And I think that that's important for us to do, which is, why we're doing a study right now out of UCLA for exactly that reason. We're looking at folks just like Nick, just like myself, and we're getting advanced heart scans to find out if there is that association with risk.
Is part of that being that if you look at the statistics, 88%, 80+% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy. Now, in all fairness, lumped into that could be individuals that have high LDL, but they have other issues as well. Their fasting insulin is high. Their fasting glucose is high. They have, other problems that are typically associated with being metabolically unhealthy. So it's not just that their LDL is high. So what you're saying is that even though there may be this association that is very clear in the literature on these large observational studies that individuals that have a higher LDL have higher risk of cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular events. It's the thing is that those individuals don't just have LDL. That's an issue. They have a plenty of other things because the population in general is metabolically unhealthy and is sick. So if you're studying a sick population, how much does this one marker matter? And maybe it matters a lot for them, and maybe it doesn't matter as much for individuals who are quite healthy. That's how I understand it. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's pretty accurate. I think maybe a good analogy might help to kind of bring home the concept that something can both be causal, but not necessarily driving disease. And we'll use cars, for example. I would be correct in saying that car tires are part of the causal chain for car accidents. In fact, if we were to ban all car tires throughout the city, we would get less car accidents. But on top of that, you would also get less people who might be saved at a hospital because they can't travel there in an ambulance because we banned all the car tires. So there's a trade-off of sorts. But if I were to say, hey, we know because when we intervene and we take away car tires that there aren't car accidents, we can therefore feel confident that the car tires are causing car accidents. You would intuitively say, I'm not sure if that's exactly accurate. I think that there are other factors such as bad weather that can impact car accidents. I think the drivers themselves and what state they're in can drive car accidents. What we really need is a test where we get people who are good drivers under good weather conditions and see if indeed the more car tires there are on the road, the more we're going to see car accidents. Does that make sense? That way you can kind of see how I'm saying something can both be part intrinsically of the causal pathway, but not necessarily the driver of it.
No, that makes absolute sense. And I think that analogy is fantastic. Talk about, or go back to what you mentioned earlier, which is there's just not a lot of data that had been out there and studies showcasing, is there some truth? Of course, getting to the full truth will take time and will take a lot of research that's there. And that's why you said, I don't exactly have, one answer on the subject, but I can give you clues based on what we're seeing that there are more threads to pull on. So what research have you been involved in? And I think recently you guys put some stuff out there for the world to get a chance to see. So could you talk about that?
Sure. So there's a couple of things. One, I'd love to highlight my good friend and collaborator, Nick Norwitz. He's a Harvard med student who, by the way, got his PhD right before going into Harvard Med. He got his PhD at Oxford. Very talented, has done an experiment that was intended, as he would concede, to draw headlines and attention to the lipid energy model that we've published. And what it was he had two different interventions. The first was that he would consume Oreo cookies above and beyond his existing ketogenic diet. And he did this for a total of 2 weeks. And he wanted to see how much his already very high levels of LDL cholesterol when he's on keto, which hovers near 400, how much it would go down as we would predict with the lipid energy model. And indeed, in 2 weeks, he had shown that it had gone down substantially, 70%. In fact, it was so substantial that they wanted to add a couple more days so that they could do this in triplicate, himself and his physicians. And sure enough, it actually went further down with each successive day. So if I remember this correctly, I think it started at around, say, 384 and went down to 111. This is in just 16 days. This is because what we would posit with the lipid energy model, and I'm going to try not to get too geeky here, is that when he's being powered by fat, like I was describing before, cholesterol ride shares in that process. It's existing in the same boats, if you will, that carry around the fat that he's powered by. And the leaner you are, the more you have to move those boats around to keep resupplying and repleting your body's stores of fat. And when becoming carb adapted, by adding more carbs in, you actually bring up your stores of stored glucose in the liver, known as glycogen. And then the liver feels less need to traffic as many of the fatty acids. You're now powered technically a little less by fat in this case, and therefore there's less need to move those boats around. And therefore, you end up with less LDL cholesterol. Now, you put that up against, of course, the most popular cholesterol-lowering drug, which is a statin. And I believe he was using a very powerful one, Crestor, and I think at 20 milligrams, which is a high dose for that power of statin, and did that for a total of 6 weeks. And at the nadir, which is the lowest point, its drop was substantially less. The first one with the Oreo cookies brought it 71% down. And I don't remember the exact number, but the statin brought it something in the neighborhood of 35% down. So of course the headline is basically Oreo cookies brought his LDL cholesterol to twice as much lower than the statins did. And that was obviously very exciting. He's been doing such an excellent job of drawing further attention through that experiment to the lipid energy model and our research. And I really have to commend him. That's probably going to be the most interesting thing I tell you during this podcast.
It's kind of a big deal. And we just want to kind of make sure everybody understands for a second, because there's a lot that's in there. On top of his ketogenic diet, his healthy low carb diet that has worked well for him for years. And, he feels this way, not saying that it's the right thing for everybody else. We're just talking about Nick and his work. And you can follow Nick and Dave on Twitter, x.com. We have their links in the show notes below, and they regularly share their experiments and the work that they're doing in the research. So on top of his low carb diet, he added in Oreo cookies. Do you know how much he was having every day?
I believe it was 2 sleeves a day.
Two sleeves a day.
It's either 1 sleeve a day or was 2 sleeves a day. But it's important to emphasize this was on top of his existing diet. So a lot of times people may assume that there was some drop in saturated fat to explain the lower level of LDL. No, this was in addition. So if anything, it was a slight increase in saturated fat. Yeah.
So already on top of his diet, already having saturated fat inside the diet, depending on how many servings this wound out to, 3 cookies typically could be, 25 grams of carbohydrates that are there. And he's having a sleeve. He's probably having 2 to 3 times that amount in a serving that's there. We can look that up exactly afterwards. But adding in these carbs, which include per serving, 14 grams of added sugar in a typical Oreo packet per serving. And he was probably, again, having 2 to 3 times that much. He showed that he could lower his LDL more than taking a statin. 71% on the Oreo cookies, 35%. And again, I've heard you share with folks who might be new to this and are unpacking this. It's not that you are trying to say, hey, we should all eat Oreo cookies and start adding them to our diet. That's not the goal here. The goal of this is to point out what? What's the goal of this experiment?
The goal is to draw attention to what we suspect, as I mentioned earlier, is physiological, that this may in fact be a normal part of the process of our body handling fat adaptation. His LDL cholesterol, before he'd gone on a ketogenic diet, his LDL was closer to 90, which would be considered very ideal. And after going on a ketogenic diet, which he's used to great effect for efficacy, for helping out with his ulcerative colitis. It's been great, except that for as lean as he is, he fits this profile as we would expect it to be, and that his LDL has gone through the roof. And so how does that get reversed? Is it really just that he's having that much more saturated fat? If you've seen interviews with him, you already know that he actually doesn't consume a lot of saturated fat, typical to most low carbers. His is more of a Mediterranean style. His primary source of fat is extra virgin olive oil, much more than I would consume. And I think his average percentage of saturated fat for the fat source is something like 15% or less. So his LDL going up fits our model. We believe it's because there's more trafficking. So what we're showing with the Oreo cookies is that it's really this repletion of the glycogen stores in the liver on top of, a higher amount of insulin, of course, to some degree, in the overconsumption. All of these factors can result in the reduction of the LDL cholesterol from this mechanism, from this larger mechanism we're talking about with the lipid energy model. And like I said, it's been great because it really has drawn a lot of attention to this research and to that model.
And the other item that I want to add in here is that, everybody would agree pretty much on all sides of the dietary spectrum that Oreo cookies, with the amount of added sugar that they have, some people may debate whether or not the excess level of carbohydrates that are there are good, neutral, or bad, right? But generally, Oreo cookies are going to be seen as an ultra-processed food. Pretty much all health experts are going to agree. We want to minimize ultra-processed food, and we want to minimize above a certain degree. There's variations and maybe debates in this. We just don't want a lot of added sugar. I think the American Heart Association even says for people that not to have more than like 40 or 50 grams of added sugar a day. I think it's somewhere around that. I could be wrong. I'll double check. So everybody agrees that eating a ton of Oreo cookies is not a good thing. And yet by doing this thing that was not a good thing, he could independently drive his LDL down, which puts into question, which is how does LDL in lean, healthy people actually transit through the body? And also, if this intervention works better as a statin, all of a sudden we're going to start recommending to those individuals in that phenotype that they need to start having things like Oreo cookies or excess carbs or added sugar in the diet. And obviously everybody would say that that's not correct. There's been a lot of, interesting receivership of this experiment that's there. A lot of people that are in the different metabolic therapy camps. Recently, we've had individuals like Dr. Chris Palmer and a few individuals from the Metabolic Mind Institute on the podcast talking about the role that ketogenic therapies and metabolic therapies can play in reversing mental health disorders, everything from schizophrenia to bipolar disorder, and the brain energy model that they're exploring that's there, the brain energy theory. And one of the biggest detractions that they've had for people saying is that, sure, maybe people's brains are getting temporary better on a ketogenic diet, but are you going to cause some other situation where they're going to have a heart attack in a few years? And a lot of them feel, very kind of naturally upset about it. It's like, I finally got my life back together and I'm not suffering from this extreme mental health condition. There's got to be more to the story than all of a sudden the thing that's great for my brain and actually helps my mitochondria repair is somehow, quote unquote, terrible for my heart if I'm generally otherwise lean and healthy as an individual. What pushback have you seen to this experiment? If you would have to stress test it from people who typically have said this lean mass hyper responder phenotype, that there's not too much to it and you guys are looking in the wrong direction, has there been pushback from those individuals on this experiment that you've seen?
We kind of anticipated that there would be some, there's no question, but to your larger point there, this is part of why we want to find any and all ways to get interest in this. In the last 5 weeks, I want to say, there's a total of 3 papers that we've had drop. And on top of those 3 papers, we've also had a presentation by our principal investigator at the Lundquist Institute for our match analysis, which I'd like to also chat with you about. But But the reason I bring this up right now in totality is more of the talk right now is on the Oreo versus statin experiment. And that's a credit to Nick Norwitz in that, yes, we just before that was a 41 randomized control trial meta-analysis that's not gotten nearly as much play, but for which we would definitely hope that more of the people who are critics of the lipid energy model would have looked at, because it very much substantiates this leaner component, particularly as you get lower than, say, 25 BMI, and the association of change in LDL cholesterol as would be predicted by the model. But again, doesn't get nearly as much chatter. It's not gotten nearly as much talk because it doesn't have something exciting and interesting like Oreo cookies somehow attached. 5.5 years ago, I did a similar experiment to demonstrate the model before I'd even connected with Nick. And it was the same thing, except that it was white bread and processed lean meat. And at that time, there wasn't as much awareness. The community wasn't quite as large as it is now. And that experiment didn't get as much play outside of the low carb community. But it was the same general idea, which is just that we're choosing things you don't associate with health. You don't associate white bread with health. You don't associate Oreo cookies with health. Nick actually improved on it in many ways, including putting it up against a statin, because that does carry a lot more weight and interest as it associates with LDL cholesterol. But that's part of the reason for choosing it, was that it gets that greater degree of interest. Ourselves, we'd love it if all of our papers got as much attention as the Oreo cookie experiment, particularly the coming match analysis. We'll find out, because that's going to be published here soon. That's out of Lundquist. That was the study that I got crowdfunded. And thanks to everybody in the community who's helped to make that happen. And for that, we're actually getting a lot of people like us, like Nick Norwitz, like myself, and we're actually scanning them with CT angiograms. And that match analysis that I'm describing, that was presented December 8th. And what Dr. Budoff showed was that when matched with this other group called Miami Heart, who had average levels of LDL, but otherwise were matched as one-to-one as possible with both demographics, with age, and many other risk factors, that the plaque levels were there was no statistical significance between the plaque levels. And that data is going to be very compelling as well. But same thing, doesn't get quite as much trafficking, doesn't quite get as much interest. So I find we have to do both. I think we have to have some experiments like this one that Nick did, but at the same time, we have to do the good science and also get the risk data, as well as to build out the mechanistic data.
You mentioned that you guys did anticipate some pushback. What has been that? If you would have to steelman the other side of things, and when people are looking in, especially for this, these individuals that are leaner and generally have really good metabolic health. Well, actually not generally, they all have good metabolic health if they're going to be in this lean mass hyper-responder category. They have, their BMI, you said, was below 25?
Generally, we find that it's not 100% of lean mass hyper-responders are below 25. It just is very common. Yeah, that they're going to be below 25. And the lower the BMI, the higher the response of increased LDL.
Yeah, I would find myself in that category, even though I have familial hypercholesterolemia, family history of cholesterol. I'm in the 21 point something BMI, 21.2, 21.5, somewhere around there. And largely my metabolic health is all in the optimal range. I get my labs done every quarter through LifeForce. I have a whole history and analysis of them. And the one that was just always seemed to be, high, and in some cases got worse. I'm not on a ketogenic diet, but I generally follow. I don't fear carbs. I will include some white rice here and there, other things in a very targeted fashion, but I would eat what would be called a low carb diet. And my LDL would continue to go higher and higher. And my ApoB, which we'll talk about ApoB as well, generally was always quite high. I don't have that historically as far back as I have my LDL. I was concerned, and I started seeking out information. My audience knows I've had a few of the cardiologists that I've worked with on here, and I have done some of these CT advanced scans, one in particular, no affiliation, that goes by the name Clearly. And I've presented my results here on the podcast that, shows that I had, no hard plaque and the tiniest amount of soft plaque that was inside of there. So I digress a little bit, but if you had to steelman the other side in terms of sophisticated responses that you've seen back to these experiments and the studies that you're working on, what does the other side say about the threads that you're pulling on and the validity of them?
So it's actually funny because I presented the Steelman argument in advance in the announcement of the UCLA study. I was describing the one out of Lundquist. I said that our study would be pretty good at answering what I like to call the big magnitude question, but it wouldn't be very good at answering the small magnitude question. So, how you brought up that how strong is the evidence for those people who are pro LDL lowering, and they would say that it's very widespread, that it's very consistent in how high your LDL is, or for that matter, how high your ApoB lipoproteins are. That's the major protein that's a part of it, as you were mentioning from earlier. The faster you will develop plaque, depending on how high it is and for how long. And the big magnitude question, as I like to call it, is, okay, so if we're looking at folks like we are in our cohort with the Lundquist Institute, and their average LDL cholesterol is 272. Well, that's in the very top 10% of the very top 1% of the general population. That's extremely high. And that's the average. Our max level person, I believe, was 582, I think, was their LDL cholesterol. So that's like at the very edge. Without question, the expectation is that at a population level, they will develop plaque rapidly. And that's because it's expected for this big magnitude of LDL exposure, they'll have a big magnitude of effect in rapid plaque progression. Now, in my announcement of the study, I said, okay, we'll at least get a chance to see that pretty quickly with these data. In fact, the study might even get closed down if Dr. Budoff is calling me, at some point and says, we have too many people showing up with advanced plaque at baseline with their first scan, right? So as it turned out, no, we actually got to all of the first scans. And I probably should have mentioned this earlier. It's a longitudinal study, which is to say we're getting a scan for each participant at day 0, and then another one at somewhere around day 365. So it's 1 year difference between the two. Well, the baseline first scan, the amount of time these folks were on the diet is around 4.7 years. So already half a decade at an LDL cholesterol, like I said, the top 10 of the top 1%. So I feel like the big magnitude question is definitely getting addressed right now. And since we didn't see a very high amount of plaque, I would say that the steelman position is for people who still would be in favor of lowering LDL. They would say, okay, well, maybe metabolic health really does have a strong impact on reducing your risk of high LDL, resulting in higher cardiovascular disease. But you'd still be better off with lower LDL, with all else being the same, but your LDL is lower. And I'll readily concede that they could be right about that point. I don't know yet. Our study is not going to be good at detecting that if we're talking about a very small amount of change in relative terms. The catch is that that's already a massive paradigm shift. Because right at this moment in time, the lipid hypothesis would posit that no, there's just no question. If you have high LDL, you are at a very severe risk for cardiovascular disease. Full stop. At a population level, doesn't matter. You will likely see a very rapid progression, even if everything else is in good shape. And that's why this is pretty exciting, because in a moment, literally this coming month, we'll have had everyone get their second scans. So we'll actually be able to do a comparison in the population. And the lipid hypothesis would posit that we should see that rapid progression given how high their LDL levels are. I don't know yet what we'll see.
And in the scan that you guys are running, it's looking at both um, hard plaque and soft plaque buildup in the body. And is that correct?
In the coronary arteries, yes, both
Yes.
calcified and non-calcified plaque.
And the reason that that's important for the audience, obviously, a lot of people have heard of getting your CT scan, looking at hard plaque, calcified plaque. It's one of those tests that is recommended, especially for individuals who hit around 40, men, earlier sometimes, depending on their family history. And hard plaque and calcified plaque is part of it. But the reason that people are so excited and why people are excited, including myself, about the study that you're doing is as better technology has come to the surface to look at soft plaque, my understanding, and you correct me if I'm wrong, soft plaque is the plaque that actually can be more dangerous to a lot of individuals. You could go in and get a CT scan done. And generally, if you're not maybe severely overweight and you're not like a heavy drinker or other stuff, you could come back with a very low score, but it could give you a false sense of reassurance because you could have very little calcified plaque, but you could have a lot of soft plaque in the arteries, which would increase your risk of cardiovascular disease. Is that correct in my understanding?
That's correct. And the very test you're talking about is called a CAC, a coronary artery calcification test. Now, it is worth mentioning that a CAC of 0, you may have heard of the hashtag power of 0. A CAC of 0 is pretty correlative. It doesn't mean that you don't have soft plaque, but there are now a lot of studies, including one that was out of Denmark, that is still shocking me to this day as to just how tightly correlated a coronary artery calcification is to soft plaque. To be sure, you can still have a large amount of soft plaque with a CAC of 0. It's just very, very unlikely. So it is true for the gold standard. I myself think, and many of my family members agree, to get something like a CT angiogram as opposed to a CAC. And a CT angiogram is like the one you mentioned with clearly. It's looking at both calcified and non-calcified plaque. And our major endpoint for this study is non-calcified plaque development. We actually specifically want to separate the two and see how much soft plaque is increased. To your point, yes, soft plaque is the more likely dangerous one, particularly if it has like a thin fibrous cap at the top. It means that it's vulnerable to rupture. And that's what you have to worry about, is if it ruptures, it can, of course, release plaque into the bloodstream, and that can create a myocardial infarction. And so, yeah, calcified is typically stabilized plaque. It can harden the arteries, of course, but you're not usually worried about a piece of calcification breaking off. It's usually the soft plaque that's a bit more concerning.
Now, going back to your matching analysis that you guys are working on with the Miami Heart, right? That's when you're referencing matching, that's the continuation of that work that you're doing there. Is that accurate?
The match analysis was in addition to the existing study we're already doing that's longitudinal. We didn't know at the time that we started that there would be this other group that we could pull metabolically healthy folks from to do a match, to actually look and find a group that matched ours. So that's like having a matched control.
Got it. So in the first part that actually was published and put out there into the world, you found, as I understand it, you found that there was not an increased risk for people who had been, again, on these low carb ketogenic diets for a period of time. There was no difference, but did they have any additional extra protection because of their diet? Did they have less plaque in the arteries? Was there any way to know about that question?
Well, that's actually one of the more interesting things. And I should correct one aspect of what you mentioned. It's not yet published. The abstract should be getting published here shortly. But Dr. Butoff, when he presented it, the data did become public. It just hasn't yet been actually, I believe it's going to be published in Metabolism, and we have another one that's going to be coming out. That's the full paper soon. But anyway, to your point, if you compare those two groups, once the match analysis was done, what we were very interested in is even if there wasn't a statistically significant difference, given the size of both those groups not being very large, did we at least see a trend toward the direction of more plaque in our cohort with a very high LDL. And actually, it was the opposite. The trend favored our group more. Our group had less total people of their proportion that had plaque at all. The majority had no plaque, 0 plaque score, whereas the Miami Heart Group had a slight majority that did have a plaque score. There was only one in our cohort that had double digits in their total plaque score, and this is out of a total plaque score of 45. So really both groups were pretty healthy, but all of our group had single-digit plaque scores, save one person who I think was at a 12. But in the other group, in Miami Heart, there actually were 4 people who had plaque scores in double digits. And if you compare the area under the curve, if you literally are looking at just the total plaque amongst all the participants and compare it to the total plaque amongst all the participants in the other group, ours actually had a lower area under the curve. Now, I always want to caveat that doesn't necessarily mean our group is doing better per se. Again, there's no statistically significant difference. But if the expectation per the lipid hypothesis that higher LDL should trend more towards greater plaque development, you would have expected that. You would have expected that the Miami Heart Group would at least be trending in a better direction at a minimum. And that's not what we saw.
There's been a lot more awareness about ApoB, right? A lipoprotein B. For those that are not as familiar with it, can you just talk about what it is and where does that fit into the equation as another sort of part of a biomarker that goes into the LDL story? And what are your thoughts about how it fits into the equation over here?
So I'm going to try to simplify this, and I'll let you be the layperson audience member. You correct me if I get too in the weeds, but I think I can pull this off. Are you ready?
Yes.
You can kind of think of these boats that I'm describing, these lipoproteins, as lipid-carrying proteins. And the major protein you hear about is ApoB. And the boats that have ApoB, they have exactly one copy of ApoB. The best way to think of them is that they start big and their job is to get small. How do they get small? They get small by dropping off their lipid cargo. So they're meant to do this shipping job of getting a lot of lipids into circulation, dropping them off to your peripheral tissues all around. There's all these docks, if you will, that the boats are docking with, and they're dropping off their cargo. And in the process of them going from big to getting small, they actually connect a lot with another fleet. And that fleet has a major protein called ApoA1, but you probably know it more by HDL. HDL is this other class of ship that you can say their job is to start small and to get big. And part of how they get big is they pick up the components that are getting dropped off by the ApoB. And as they get bigger, they have more cargo on board, particularly cholesterol. And so that's why this process where things like triglycerides, which is the stored form of fat, which those ApoB start out with, are getting dropped off rapidly. They rapidly increase the amount of HDL cholesterol. That's why HDL tends to go up while triglycerides go down, and vice versa. As somebody becomes metabolically less healthy, their HDL goes down, but their triglycerides go up. And we would posit this is a systemic failure. Those ApoB lipoproteins packed full with triglycerides are failing to find anywhere to dock. There's no parking for fat in your fat cells. The fat cells are like, we don't have any more storage. We don't have any more room. There's no tissues that want to oxidize that fat. They're like, what are you talking about? We've got more than enough. And so what do you have? You have this combination of more VLDL, which is what they started out as before becoming LDL. You have more triglycerides. You have low HDL. All these things in combination. And that's why, Dhru, this is why it's so important to think of these things mechanistically. Modern lipidology tries to pick each of these different components and then assign how much each of them applies risk in isolation. And the engineer in me is like, why would you do that? Why not look at this entire profile? Look at the whole scene that's out there in the bloodstream. And then from that, try to figure out how much there's a root cause that's causing both this profile in these lipids and the atherosclerosis. So you were talking about insulin earlier. People who are hyperinsulinemic, now they've driven themselves to a point where their system is broken and they're not metabolizing these things at a high level. And therefore, you not only see these changes in their lipid profile, but you also see that they develop heart disease faster. But how much are those two having the same root cause that are causing both, as opposed to one root cause that's causing a change in lipids, and then through various levels, each of those lipids, impact atherosclerosis directly. That's why, understanding the lipid energy model, we hope, will better bring this all into view.
When you think about your own health and regularly getting blood work, that was one of the big claims to fame that you were known for in the beginning. You're a software engineer by background. You're not a physician, a researcher in the field of coming from traditional research in the field of healthcare, having a PhD in that background or a master's. You were an individual, as you mentioned, who went on this diet, low carb, ketogenic diet, because you were convinced that this would help your health and you would feel better. And you did feel better. And I think there was a period of time in the early days, like you were testing your blood. Was it almost every day you were testing your blood and like putting out the results?
Yeah, there's a number of experiments where I tested my blood every day, and I'm talking blood draws where like I really went to LabCorp. But there was even a few experiments where I have something called a cardio check, which requires a bit more than a glucometer. You actually have to fill a capillary tube. But there's an experiment where I want to say it was maybe 28 days. I was taking my lipids 6 times a day. So when I woke up at 9, at 10, at 12, 2, 7, and right before I went to sleep, if memory serves. But that alone already provided enormous data because, again, a lot of how they currently approach lipids is they think it doesn't change that fast. But I would argue it definitely does. It definitely changes quite a bit. And especially if you're using it metabolically, especially if you're fat adapted and you need to make use of it. So yeah, I would argue that a lot of the lipid energy model was taught to me through these experiments. Like there's a lot that I learned from the textbooks, from, having a PDF copy of clinical lipidology, but nowhere near as having some hypotheses that I could just test easily because I had access to these devices, because I made connections with people who I could get these wide spectrum blood tests with LabCorp, for example. That turned out to be very meaningful. It really helped out a lot.
Well, the reason I brought this up was that how do you think about when it comes to your own health? Of course, right? This is you sharing your story. This isn't medical advice to anybody out there in the world. How do you think about your levels? Do you generally think of, do you still, first of all, regularly test get your blood drawn and have a history of your markers? And when it comes to these categories of things like LDL, ApoB, are there things that you pay attention to? I'm sure you do, just out of the fact that you're just interested in this space as a whole. But do you have any thresholds, or are you paying attention to the numbers at all? Or do you generally feel, look, if my metabolic health is in a good position, I personally, again, this is your personal thought, I'm not too worried about the fluctuations that might happen, including those individual two markers, going up higher. What is your sense when it comes to your own health and your own biomarkers?
For me personally, I feel as though I'm doing my due diligence in that, like you, I've got a CT angiogram. I've actually had 2. I've had a total of 3 CACs and 2 CT angiograms. But to be fair, a CT angiogram includes a CAC. You probably already know this. The first pass they make is to check on your calcification. So when I say that, the reason I bring this forward is regardless of what's happening within my blood, nothing beats actual detection of the disease itself. You're going to have a tough time convincing me that anything is as important as actually looking at the geography of the heart. So if I know where that's at and I'm feeling good about it, then I'm not as concerned as I might be in looking at particularly a biomarker, a blood biomarker in isolation. Now, what's the next layer, I guess you can say, of risk concern for me that I am looking for? It's inflammatory markers. My favorite, which most people already know about, is C-reactive protein. It's a very high sensitivity, non-specific inflammatory marker, and it's really good. Now, to be sure, you can have false positives, but you almost never get a false negative, or at least I find in what I'm doing. If it's low, if it's like under 1, I'm feeling pretty good, because usually when it's well above 1, especially, then at that point I want to investigate further. Inflammation is, heart disease especially is an inflammatory disease. And what I like about inflammatory markers is it at least kind of gives you a sense of where the body feels it's at. It's kind of like knowing if the emergency services are getting called out. And so in that sense, it's something that I think everyone needs to be mindful of. But again, I'll just mention real quick, you can have false positives. For example, don't work out right before your blood test, because you are in fact inflaming your body. That's literally part of the point, right? But I have had in fact, to prove this, I think I've taken something over in the neighborhood of 110 C-reactive protein tests total. But a few of those times I intentionally got them following a half marathon. And that's when I've seen them at the highest. I've had it as high as 52 once, 38 once, and 52 once, which was after, pretty brutal half marathons where I, set personal records.
In an ideal world, would you recommend that people, if they're going to go in and get these tests done and include these inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein, they should just get the blood work done early and they haven't worked out at all that day? Is that an ideal recommendation?
Definitely. Now, there's something else that I'd like to draw attention to, which is I do think in being in this space, I've definitely come to find that there are a lot of over-exercisers. It's something we were worried about with our study, that some of the lean mass hyperresponders we'd get might be over-exercisers. And by that, I mean folks who just don't give themselves enough time for recovery. Some people get really addicted. There are runners. There's one I just talked to recently who loves to run 10 miles a day. And as long as your body can handle that, it's fine. But he's exactly the person who I said, hey, you may want to get blood work the next morning just to confirm inflammatory markers aren't high. Otherwise, maybe you're not giving yourself enough time to recover, and there's just too much of a backlog of repair that your inflammatory response is trying to work with, your immune response is trying to work with. So I think inflammation is very important. I know it gets a bad rap. People talk about it like it's the bad guy, but it's really not the bad guy. It's true. There are things like autoimmune where it is more the bad guy. But generally speaking, inflammation is the process of healing. We die without it. We need inflammation to some extent. And so you want to be sure that your body succeeds at the inflammation the same way you want to be sure it succeeds at lipid delivery, for example. And so outside of that, other markers are the typical ones, CBC. But as far as lipids go, I'm much more interested in HDL and triglycerides than I am, say, LDL or ApoB or LDLP, for example.
Any other associative markers, that you feel that are important as a part of, even if they're not directly connected, they might be an indirect item that are important when it comes to our metabolic health, our heart health? Are you paying attention to, vitamin D, any other markers that are there that you would say are on your top list when it comes to this topic and category that we're talking about?
Well, the other that I would put as part of the big three is insulin itself, fasted insulin. If your fasting insulin levels are elevated, that's concerning. I've had many conversations with family members about that. Again, fasted. For those folks who say, hey, you don't have to be on a ketogenic diet, but sure, your insulin might go up and, having carbohydrates if you're on a carb-centric diet. I know plenty of people who are on a carb-centric diet. They're doing fine. They're metabolically healthy. but they, like my low carb friends, would have a low fasted insulin level. So maybe the insulin under the curve might even be a bit higher, but in the morning, their insulin levels are low. You want your insulin levels low. Let me put it a different way. There's no good reason for your one major anabolic hormone, insulin, to be elevated after 12 hours of doing nothing. If you've slept overnight, you've not worked out, you've not eaten, there's no reason why that hormone should be high. So I call that the big three, in that if I were to get 3 tests, I'd get a lipid panel, I'd get C-reactive protein, I'd get fasting insulin. Vitamin D, I'm kind of glad you brought that up. Vitamin D is a pretty serious issue. And we all know why. We all know it's because we're spending way too much time indoors. Of course, it's better if people can just intentionally take more time to get outdoors. Yes, you can dose up to some degree, but one of the interesting things about learning about lipid delivery, particularly in things like supplements, is that it can be a challenge for things like megadoses to some degree. There's throughout our intestines, our enterocytes. Those are the cells that line. They're kind of like the fingers, if you will, that line the intestinal tract. And you may already know this. Supplements kind of are a little hit or miss on the degree with which they can absorb, especially if they're in a high concentration. So the one thing I would advise for people who are doing that is just try to always eat it with food, especially if it's a fat-soluble vitamin. Vitamin D is fat-soluble. So ideally you have it with food so that your stomach acids can get moving and so forth. But I myself, living in Las Vegas, I do intentionally try to take, 45 minutes to an hour of walking, or just trying to even be outside, or even just working outside in the backyard. Vitamin D is very, very vital. It's extremely vital to the nuclei of your cells, just to do their general transcription work. But it is true. We do not get as much outside time as a species anymore.
One of the cardiologists that I work with, who we've had here on the podcast, represents, his name is Dr. Michael Twyman, really nice, sweet guy, does the personalized approach to cardiology and looks at all aspects of things. One of the theories that he puts forward and presented to our audience is that, we talk a lot about diet, we talk about LDL, we talk about ApoB. Of course, there's good reasons, and we've highlighted a lot of those good reasons. An area that we don't talk about as much that he believes is an important part of cardiovascular disease is the health of our endothelial lining. And the theory that he put out there is that there are some major sort of lifestyle behaviors that we have in our modern world where our endothelial health, the single cell lining that lines our arteries, and when that lining is disrupted by inflammation, it creates almost a sort of pothole in the street that things can get caught in. And when we think about our lipids are floating around, and they're neither good nor bad, so to speak. We might think of them as being elevated, but they're neither good nor bad, but that these lipid particles could get caught in these potholes and these divots. And when we asked him, what are some of the top things that you believe are damaging the endothelial lining and the endothelial, I always mispronounce it, but glycocalyx, what is damaging that? The list of a few things that he mentioned is, of course, chronic inflammation. When these markers are lifted, and there's a lot of debates about, different things that are driving chronic inflammation. But of course, definitely ultra processed foods are a big part of that. A diet that is, very high pharmaceutical levels of sugar, which unfortunately is a lot of people's diet in America, with over 65 to 68% of Americans, getting a huge amount of sugar in their diet. But he also added in a few other things, excessive drinking, and there might be certain populations that don't do as well with alcohol, not getting photobiomodulation, which is basically not having exposure to healthy sunlight, not getting your morning sunlight in the morning, which is helpful for your mitochondria, not getting your evening sunlight, and then maybe a handful of other things like not having healthy levels of nitric oxide inside of the body, largely because of a sedentary lifestyle, as well as having ultra processed foods. What have you come across as truly, I mean this in the highest compliment, as a amateur professional? You have to put those two things together. You're an amateur professional citizen researcher who's in this field. What have you found out or thought of? And do you think that there's any truth to that when it comes to the endothelial lining and its role in cardiovascular disease?
Yeah. So this is actually an area that I'm quite obsessed with. I did a lecture recently on a process called transcytosis, which we'll get into in a second. But I'm need a little bit of license because I am going to have to kind of get in the weeds, because this is an area that
Let's do it.
I'm genuinely excited about. First of all, odds are everybody who's thinking of endothelial layer, which is the layer of cells that line our vessel walls, particularly around the arteries, odds are whatever your construct is, it's off. Let me try to reconstruct it for you. So yes, you start out with a one cell layer set of endothelial cells, typically called the endothelium. And that over time will actually increase in something called DIT, or diffuse intimal thickening. So you actually end up with more cells on top. And there's some debate as to why that happens, but there's something else that's happening all the time with everybody constantly. And it's that they're getting injured and they constantly need repair. That's just happening all the time. If you're born with a disease that results in you producing less anti-inflammatory factors towards clotting, you'll end up with millions of clots like right away. And a lot of those people never make it to birth because they can't have the antagonistic opposing anti-inflammatory part of the existing clotting cascade. So think of it a bit like shingles on a roof. The shingles just constantly need some re-roofing, and that's fine. This gets us back to the immune response. You have immune cells. Almost half of your blood are cells devoted to the immune response. Platelets, neutrophils, but the one that we're going to be really interested in is something called monocytes. And the reason why is because when there's damage that is done to endothelial cells, there are levels of complexity. And the easiest level is something called primary hemostasis. Hemo is blood, stasis is control, right? Hemostasis. And that just needs one platelet or a few platelets for what's known as a platelet plug. They're coming by, they adhere, and then it's kind of like, no problem, we got a Band-Aid on it. That's all we needed. Past that is something called secondary hemostasis, and already it's much more complex. Now you actually need to get red blood cells involved, and you need to build a clot to close that breach, right? But here's something that's important to bear in mind. The injury, or a cell, an endothelial cell getting in trouble on its own in some fashion, they release the inflammasomes. They release the chemicals that call inflammation toward them. They're a site of inflammation. So now immune cells are attracted by design. They're attracted to that site of inflammation. And they have to first make sure there's no hemorrhaging through that breach. They have to cover it. That's the first important part. But then there's a second important part that brings us back around to this process of plaque development. And that's what's happening underneath. So underneath, if you've got a site of inflammation, it's pretty serious. Then there's a bunch of things, a lot of things I'm not going to cover, but there's one thing we're very, very interested in, which is those monocytes. Those are cells that actually get stopped. There's a process called VCAM. You don't need to remember that, but they're slowed down like a bunch of speed bumps. and they're brought in between these junction gaps between endothelial cells so that they can differentiate into macrophages. Macro is big, phage is eat. And they're like giant amoebas that work for us. They get into that space underneath the endothelial cells, that subintimal space. And guess what? They are a big component of the plaques that we find, right? And so what the current present hypothesis is that LDL particles get somehow into that space. Macrophages come and they consume it. And then they kind of can't help themselves. They just stay there. They never go anywhere. But one of the first questions I asked when I was learning about all this is why? Macrophages are actually very mobile. They're, like I said, they're like amoebas. They're quickly grabbing all of the bad stuff that's there and they clear it out. And they're good at it. They're very good at clearing it out. But if you go into a plaque, it's necrotic. Necrotic means that there's dead macrophages that do have cholesterol inside them. But why? Why did they die? And I'm like a detective going, come on, guys, these machines, they run great under normal circumstances. Why aren't they going anywhere? And that's why I had to understand more of the physiology of that space, that area. So the way that you described it back to me, I would already have a bunch of complaints. Here's why. That glycocalyx, those are like long stalks and they're like fur. They're like fur that are on top of that bilayer that is the endothelial cell, right? So LDL particles are 22.5 nanometers in size. They're not busting right through that fur. But even if they could, underneath that fur is the bilayer that's 5 to 10 nanometers in width. Underneath that is the cell itself with a cytoskeleton and organelles and all of that. So you'd have to believe that they bust through the fur, through the bilayer, in and around all of those organelles without turning them to Swiss cheese, and then still have enough force to bust through the other side of the other bilayer and into the subintimal space. So already just learning that basic amount of physiology, I was like, this doesn't actually make a lot of sense to me. Now, the junction gaps opening up at a site of inflammation. Again, the first thing is the inflammation. The second thing is the response, which includes endothelial cells intentionally separating out so that the monocyte could differentiate in and become a macrophage. That makes sense. Now those junction gaps are larger. They're originally 5 to 10 nanometers with proteins going in between them like a zipper. There's no way that was going to just squeeze through. Now that's one way LDL particles can come through. But guess what? There's another one. It's very important. Endothelial cells undergoing inflammation. It's now recognized that they have a higher amount of transcytosis. Trans being transport, cytosis being a process of the cell. So in a controlled fashion, endothelial cells, hear me when I say this, endothelial cells are binding to non-modified LDL particles at a higher rate and pulling them through endothelial cells to the subintimal space down below. I think that's no accident. I think LDL particles are participants in the innate immune response. I know that's controversial to say that, but I've said a lot of things that are controversial that have been my hypotheses up until this point, and I'm getting less and less afraid to just put those hypotheses out there. I'll emphasize that, right? But this brings me back to the question of whether inflammation is causing LDL particles to go into the subintimal space. Technically, yes. But what's causing the inflammation? In particular, what's causing it at that threshold, at such a threshold that it never regains control? And so if you've got things like, say, high blood pressure, well, that's a lot easier to answer because now it's mechanical. If you've got a site of inflammation and you actually are environmentally preventing those immune cells from ever getting a good level of control over that environment in the subintimal space, then it makes sense to me that the plaque is going to continue to grow, right? Because the more complex the injury, the more difficult it is for them to get to a degree of stabilization. Getting back to the roofer analogy, right? I'm in Las Vegas. It'd be pretty easy for me to fix my roof right now. But imagine if there was like a category 4 storm that was just going around the clock. Well, I would start trying to get out the duct tape and the plastic and try to just, that to me is what calcification is. That's why you find plaques at areas for which there's greater shear stress, is it's more difficult for things like macrophages to have the same level of control in places like that for mechanical stress reasons. It makes total sense. And it's why, by the way, I think you find people like runners who will have, like, say, an occlusion in just the LAD, right? Just the Widowmaker, but they won't have it throughout the rest of the vascular system. But then you get somebody who was born with a genetic disease of dysfunction in lipid metabolism, such that their own immune cells, their own macrophages, can't metabolize lipids or lipoproteins very well. And they have it all over the place. The clues are right there, in my opinion. Sorry, I think I really went on a bit of a bit of a monologue there, but this is the engineer in me loves this part of it, because that's much easier to kind of understand and work with. And yet that's the more controversial area because of how certain everybody in lipidology feels that LDL is the true root cause.
Well, we've had a lot of certainty throughout the history of medicine and society, and ideas have upended, and they've always started off with a group of individuals who are willing to question things and say that, hey, we may not have the whole story, but there's something here worth pulling on. And that's what you, Nick, and the rest of the individuals that you're working with and the community that you've helped put together are all getting a chance to do. Just one thing that you said that I'm just trying to make sure I connected the dots, right? Because, I haven't spent nearly as much time in this area as you have. Part of what I heard you say that I'm extracting out is that you believe that LDL, or do you believe rather, that LDL and these lipids are actually an important part of the sort of, plaster fixing process, right? Like they're an important part of like kind of the healing process. Is that kind of what I gathered from one section that you were sharing, or did I completely mess that up?
Yes. Let me just say a qualified yes. It's a bit more, I mentioned earlier the car tires and the car accidents. If you take steps to remove LDL particles from the equation, then I believe you'll end up with less relative incidence of cardiovascular disease, or at least less development of plaque on a net if you get to large scale numbers, right? Because you're kind of removing that part of the cascade. But to be fair, I think the same thing about macrophages themselves. I think there are other components of the immune response that you could inhibit, and you'll end up with less potential of plaque formation. The reason I want to bring that to the front, though, is obviously I think highly of the natural body's immune response. It's a lot of the process of atherosclerosis itself. So I don't feel it's as certain as to what the trade-off is for folks who are metabolically healthy. It may well be that metabolically healthy folks who really lower their LDL and do nothing else but lower their LDL have a reduction in cardiovascular events without a trade-off of some other kind, without there, for example, being other things that are associated with a robust immune response that might or might not get affected. I don't want to put a hypothesis out there for that, other than I'm interested in us studying it, because it's possible that there is. It's possible that there's a trade-off. I'm not asserting it, but it would explain why it is that folks who have very low levels of LDL associationally tend to have lower lifespans. It's associational data, as I'll understandably qualify. But if LDL were only pathogenic, if it only caused cardiovascular disease, and that there was no trade-off in its lack of presence, then you would expect it'd be like smoking, right? That people who were lucky enough to be born smoking no cigarettes a day, where the rest of us were born smoking a pack a day, they would live longer than the rest of us. And I haven't actually seen any data that shows that. Even people born with PCSK9 loss of function, that's a genetic disease that's the opposite of FH. You're born with very low levels. I mean, we're talking like 30 milligrams per deciliter your entire life. They don't live longer than the average of their population. But you would think that they would, right? If there was no trade-off at all, because again, cardiovascular disease is the number one killer. And that's not what we see. Again, all the same caveats. It's observational data. Observational data is not great at proving causation, but it is good at knocking down claims of causation because the data should align with something that's being claimed as a cause.
That makes sense. Super clear. While I have you here, just a few areas that I want to get your sort of thoughts on as we sort of extrapolate out the potential sort of implications of this and how the average person who's listening here and is trying to make sense of how they eat, what they eat, how they approach things, the lifestyle they live. So would love for you to get a chance to comment on, because something else, just as your Oreos experiment, Nick's Oreos experiment, has made a lot of headlines and garnered a lot of attention in a really great way to help ask a lot of questions about LDL. There's been other things that have also been in the news on this topic of LDL. And one of them is the vegan twins study and the associated Netflix documentary that whose title I'm blanking on right now, but that's been in the news a bunch. For those that are not following, I'm sure you've seen people talk about it, but if you haven't, there was some Stanford researchers that basically took twins, and one group of them was put on a omnivore, diet. They could eat vegetables, but they could eat, meat as well. And then the other group was basically put on a vegan diet and it ate only a plant-based diet. And I believe it was 8 weeks, somewhere around there, 6 to 8 weeks that they were on these respective protocols. And the reason that the study was getting a lot of attention is because there was a significant drop in LDL in the individuals who are following the plant-based approach. So the headlines in the documentary, were really touting that this is why a plant-based diet makes sense for a lot of people, because we want LDL. And of course, you already talked about the big observational data that's out there, which is large in volume with LDL and cardiovascular disease. But what is your take on the vegan twin study? I don't know if you watched the documentary or not, just because even though we've talked about themes that are going to be part of your answer, it's nice for the audience to sort of hear your perception of that study and what it means and what it doesn't mean.
Well, and full disclosure, I hadn't actually watched it. I've watched a few videos, including Nick. He has a great summarizing video. Shout out to Nick on his, it was actually pretty viral too, because I think he hit a lot of great touch points. A lot of times somebody does such a good summary video and you weren't specifically attracted to watching something that you're like, oh, I think that's probably pretty good. And I won't judge it too harshly unless I actually do watch it all. But I will say that this is a commonality. It's common that if somebody goes from a low carb ketogenic diet over to a more plant-based vegan diet, there are a couple things that my expectation is would result in lower LDL cholesterol. Per the lipid energy model, again, probably higher relative carbohydrate intake. And if that's the case, if you're powered more by carbs, if you're powered less by fat, probably you're going to see a change in your LDL cholesterol. Again, kind of depends on how lean and metabolically healthy you are. The other component is fiber. It is true that generally speaking, the more you're consuming fiber, especially for things like gastric emptying, the use of bile acid, that it creates more demand on the liver to take up more LDL particles. What did kind of fascinate me is, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think the drop was just like 16 milligrams per deciliter. It was like just barely over statistical significance, if my memory serves. And that I was kind of, it impresses me that ends up becoming the big headline, because that's the thing I keep coming around to is when I started on this, I didn't actually realize how many things are really built on the lipid hypothesis that are built on LDL. And for that matter, how much people see it as basically the disease itself. That if you have higher LDL, it's as good as if you already have heart disease. It's often referred to as cardiovascular health. Just your LDL level is your cardiovascular health, as though they're congruent, that they're the same thing. And that's kind of important because, for example, with the study that we're doing out of Lundquist, they don't just have high LDL, they have high LDL because many of them are carnivore. Some of them are, extremely high fat, for example. So you have folks who are typically on diets very high in saturated fat, very high in red meat, very high in animal protein. All of these things are getting vilified a lot, and for that matter, typically are low in fiber. And will we see that corresponding expectation met of rapid onset of cardiovascular disease? We're about to find out. So in a roundabout way, our study is kind of hitting lots of notes at the same time. Obviously, there's not just the high LDL. It's that they're on a diet that's checking all the boxes for what not to do.
Yeah, I'm pulling it up over here. I believe if this article is accurate from CBS News, which covered the study, it was 22 vegans in total. The LDL cholesterol drop was 14 milligrams per deciliter,
Oh, 14.
which was more than a 10% drop. But if we go back to the Oreo experiment, how much of a drop came from Nick's own experience just with being on Oreos, right? What was the number again, if you don't mind mentioning?
It was, if I'm not mistaken, it's 384 down to 111. But the total percent of the drop was 71%, almost 3/4 of his LDL wiped out in 16 days. So
I don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so yeah, it's both Nick and I, if we were taking our lipids, if I was doing what I was describing earlier, let's say I was using my cardio check and I was just checking my lipids throughout the day, it absolutely exceeds 14 milligrams per deciliter just in the course of the day, going up and down. But then again, I wouldn't be surprised if that's going to be the case for many of us who are fat adapted.
So theoretically speaking, if Nick's experiment was extrapolated out and you could find, a group of twins that fit this model of lean mass hyper responders, you could actually make an entire documentary and study of giving them Oreos, and you'd expect that one group, which was the control, which was eating a traditional ketogenic or low carb diet, and the other group, which was same diet, but was given a sleeve or 2 sleeves of Oreo a day, you'd expect the headlines to go gangbusters because you'd see probably on average a 50%, 60%, 70% drop in LDL that would be there. If we would extrapolate it out, we would see something like that. Again, that's the hypothesis, and that's why you guys were doing the experiment, which number one, is that accurate? Not is that accurate? We don't know until that was done, but that's at least the theory that would be there. And number two, it sort of puts into question the idea that a 10% drop in LDL just in itself, without necessarily looking at the actual level of hard plaque and soft plaque in the body, means much of anything. It could mean, and I think this is why I really appreciate your work, because part of what you're saying is that if you're not healthy as an individual and you look more like a metabolically unhealthy American, and you're eating kind of like a standard American diet, then, an increase in LDL probably is, and most likely is going to be problematic for you just based on the amount of observational data. We don't know maybe fully. That's not the part that you guys are looking into, but that's kind of a little bit of what I'm hearing you say. But if you are a healthy individual, then maybe that drop in LDL doesn't mean anything. And in fact, we can actually get it to drop a lot higher if we just fed you a shit ton of Oreos.
I think what I would say is I don't know on that last part. I genuinely don't know. Here's the challenge. The challenge is, for me, the way that I would want studies to be conducted overall is I'm a big fan of transparency. All of the papers that we've done, we've released the code and the data as we published it. I would love if more studies were done in the same fashion. Unfortunately, a lot of pharmaceutical studies, their data is proprietary and there's not quite as much access. There's not quite as much ability to do analyses, but I'd love to do subgroup analyses at least to help build on hypotheses like that. What populations have the most benefit from various interventions, whatever they are? And that gets to the larger arc of your question is if there's some degree of LDL levels that are truly physiological, they are part of a process of either being fat adapted or being carb adapted, and that won't translate to cardiovascular disease risk. Let's find out, because there are a lot of folks who are on a ketogenic diet, not for ethical reasons, but for medical ones, like Nick. Nick has been using the ketogenic diet to work with his ulcerative colitis, and it's just been a godsend. And I know so many people who have his story across multiple various ailments, such as having epilepsy, such as type 1 diabetics, and so forth. They have everything going for them except this one thing, and that's why we need to know, right? So once we have that data in hand, at least to be able to say it for those folks who are metabolically healthy, that would be the first step to us getting a better sense of this more complex version, at a minimum, of what we think we understand today. That's the one other thing I'll just mention. I think I also underestimated how much I think as a species, we really like a simple problem that turns out to have a simple solution. And so in a way, if you look back, that's how medicine has been. It's for a long time, we were pretty attached to the body makes too much blood. And that's why therapeutic bloodletting is so great for all these various ways of curing diseases. And it took us a long time to get over the possibility that, no, actually, maybe the body is pretty good about its production of blood and maintaining blood pressure and so forth. What do you do? Sometimes it just takes a while.
So would love to get your perspective, right? You're not a medical doctor. I'm not asking for, medical advice, but, just as I'm navigating my own relationship with these areas, and I'm just as confused as anybody else trying to talk to experts like yourself and other people who are looking at this, getting all the different angles and markers to be a little bit more educated, in terms of how I approach things. So I did my, Clearly scan. I saw that there was basically non-existent soft plaque and hard plaque that was there. It looked extremely clean, at least from the individuals that, had interpreted for me. And my brother-in-law also took a look. He's a cardiologist who's, in this field as well. Shout out to Dr. Neil Patel. And I'm sort of looking at things and I'm taking everybody's information, and I'm hearing people, experts that are out there, that are saying, look, even if you feel healthy and everything else is, good, we just don't know the answer to a lot of these things. We may not know the answer. So with an ApoB that is elevated, I believe that, 3-4 years ago, when I was doing a little bit more of, it wasn't a true ketogenic diet, but it was a much higher fat diet than I was used to eating. I think my ApoB was like somewhere in the high, almost like right under like 200, somewhere around there, like 180, something like that. Then I got a little bit spooked and I started sort of cutting out some added saturated fat in my diet, moving towards more leaner, cuts of meat. And naturally it sort of kind of came down, but still not being fat, not being fearful of fat, having plenty of fat that was out there, but definitely watching how much saturated fat was coming into the body. And then it came down to about 124, went back up to 144. And all along the time, my LDL was around like 250, 218. At its lowest, it came down to 167. And I was chatting with the cardiologist, plural, that I was working with. And I have a few I had some advanced genetic testing done. And I saw that I had a few of the genetic, I don't know exactly how to say them, SNPs, markers, I don't know, genes that are associated with and connected to, familial hypercholesterolemia. I'm a hyper-reabsorber is what I was told. I don't know if I got that right, but that's some of what I was told. It's not that I'm a hyper-producer, but I'm a hyper-reabsorber. So one of the recommendations that was given to me personally, again, this is my interaction with my medical team, was, look, you're doing a lot of things that are right. You're getting your morning sunlight. You're doing high intensity interval training, which has, not every single day, but you're including, one or two of those workouts. You're getting strength training in, you might be taking some supplements that could be beneficial, like aged garlic extract. There's some studies that are there, and you got the Clearly scan done, and you don't have any, soft plaque or little to no soft plaque that's there. But if we want to ensure if you are thinking about rolling the dice with your own health, you might want to think about having something like ezetimibe. For those that are not familiar, pharmaceutical intervention, which, as I understand, is related to the reabsorption of cholesterol and lipids inside of the body, and has shown an impact on reducing, your LDL. So I started that. I took ezetimibe, and I asked around, and generally I saw that, there's always potential side effects that were there, but that it was, comparatively to some of the concerns that people have about statins and other things, it seemed to be pretty mild to, not really anything strong that I was personally worrying about. And my LDL did come down. It dropped from, in a matter of a few months of me just being on ezetimibe, I think it came from like 200 down to like 102. And my ApoB went from like 144 down to like 86. And I'm due for a test actually next week. So I'll get my latest numbers, and it'll now be about 4 or 5 months that I've been on that. I am just, trying to make the decision for myself. And I guess, if you have any comments on that, right? I'm not generally worried about, the more that I learn, and especially me fitting into this, phenotype of a lean mass hyper responder, the more that I learn. And because I got my Clearly scan done, and I don't see hard plaque and I don't see soft plaque that's there. And because I'm interested in longevity, I just turned 41 last year. I sort of like, okay, cool. Like, I guess I'll be on this, but then I'm also worried about like dropping my LDL too low. That's there, right? Because that's something that you mentioned. So that's what I'm navigating. Do you have any commentary on what I'm navigating as an individual? Again, not medical advice, not anything. Do you have any commentary on what I'm navigating?
So I'm probably going to give you a pretty unsatisfying answer.
That's okay. I'm all good with the unsatisfactory answer. I want the truth, right? I want the truthful answer that's there of how you feel about things.
Well, it's a little more than that. So when I was first entering the space, I thought it would be like the culture I come from with engineering, which is that we are firing off hypotheses everywhere. We're excited to chat about the thing that we're into. And while my social media profile was relatively low, that was fine. As my social media profile has increased, and particularly as I've taken on more research partners who themselves are cardiologists, who are lipidologists, and so forth, I have to be more mindful of anything that I could say that could be taken as individual medical advice. You'd think that I could just say, listen, don't take anything I say as medical advice. I'm not a medical professional, etc. Blah, blah, blah. But I do find that even in spite of that, there is that potential risk. So I'm going to kind of...
And you don't want to taint your research, right? That's your endeavor now.
Right. But at the same time, I do want to draw attention to that being kind of a problem, because science is very much about building hypotheses, discussing them openly, working through what you think is going on. And in the day and age of information and this technology sharing and social media and what we're doing right now, there shouldn't be that level of reluctance, or at least there should be that expectation. The caveat is baked in. So with all that said, here's what I can tell you is going on with our existing lean mass hyperresponder Facebook groups, which you mentioned you're like a member. It seems as though that is the most popular intervention for those folks who are seeking to lower their LDL. They seem to, it's anecdotal, respond the best to having ezetimibe, that the reduction in absorption as a means by which to get to lower levels appears to be tolerated well compared to others. And if you were to probably take a poll, that's my guess, is ezetimibe in particular is probably one of the most used. I myself, again, I've got to kind of caveat I don't know. I will add one more thing, though, on the concern for being too low. From having crunched those data myself with R and so forth, I'm usually referring to, at least of my own crunch data, it's usually something in the lowest quartile or quintile. And again, it's observational. If a lipidologist were in the room who's very pro LDL lowering, they would rightly point out, hey, some amount of that, could be reverse causation, which is a fair point, except that it seems to go across all time scales. So there's not a time scale. Even if you censor out the first 3, even 5 years, you still have people who, if they're at the lowest level 20 years earlier, they're still going to be more likely to die. But those are usually at very low levels. Those usually at levels like, say, less than 70, less than 60, something like that. And again, it's observational. I think if you were to stratify by metabolic health, there would be a lot of equalization across the board. This is why, we want to always think, or at least I would say, I always want to think in terms of these lipid profiles as resulting from something more than they are driving something. That's so far still my hypothesis.
No, that's super helpful. And I appreciate, we need you to be cautious in your languaging because you are moving forward important research. And one way or another, we're going to continue to, you and your group are going to continue to pull on this thread. And that's just going to be interesting. And it's going to bring up great questions. Probably a lot of questions in the beginning, more so than immediate answers. But those questions are an important part of scientific discovery. And, I want to thank you and your team for being a part of that and all the incredible people that you work with. And Nick, who we mentioned, we're going to link to all those individuals below. Dave, as we wind down over here, any final thoughts that you want to leave our audience with and how they can participate if they're curious about this and they want to be a part of the movement? You mentioned you crowdfund a lot of these studies that you've been now getting a chance to get into. Where do you want to send our audience to? So final thoughts and then where people can follow you.
Sure. And thanks for the opportunity on doing the plug. We have the Citizen Science Foundation. That's the 501c3 bona fide public charity that I founded. We have a legitimate 0% admin overhead. Literally none of us take any money, save some amount that goes towards, say, credit card processing or other third-party transaction fees. If people want to donate, they can go to citizensciencefoundation.org to donate directly, or even better, come join us in Las Vegas. Maybe you'll get a chance to come on over. In March 15th and 16th, we have a fundraiser that's basically a conference. We have a lot of big names coming, like Dom DiAgostino, Nick Norwitz himself will come. We have Dr. Budoff, our principal investigator. He's going to be giving the keynote. And it's going to be a great time. It'll be a lot of fun, and it's for a good cause. Your donation is your ticket in. As far as on social media, you can find me under Real Dave Feldman, x.com/Twitter/Real Dave Feldman. Same thing for my YouTube channel. Same thing for Instagram. But I'm more active on Twitter in particular myself. And I hope everyone continues to stay curious. If there's anything that I'm proud of beyond the research that we're doing ourselves, I love whenever I find that people are bringing their unique insights from coming outside of formal research that actually helps out research, because I myself have gotten a lot of the ideas that have helped to build the lipid energy model for me from other folks who themselves aren't lipidologists. So don't underestimate your ability to work out new things that we all need to know.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for having the courage to put yourself out there, even though we have so much history in medical history and other fields too, but importantly in medicine, that the outsider's idea that was at least willing to question the status quo, if not directly, indirectly often led to the contribution of important work that changed our ideas about foundational things that we thought were true. And I know you got a lot of pushback. In fact, I won't name the guest by name, but I brought your name up in the lean mass hyper responder to an individual who was on the podcast in the early days. And they kind of just laughed me off, the fact that I even would acknowledge it as if it was a thing worth addressing. And this individual, who was well-intentioned and, kind of came from the world of plant-based eating, they even intentionally went out of their way to kind of share a clip out there on social media of just showcasing how much they knew about something and how it was done in a tasteful way, but it really was to highlight just how misinformed and kind of when they started to realize the interview was going off track when I started bringing up these questions about their thoughts, which I thought were genuine questions and I still think are. And nonetheless, I'm sure you've gotten a lot of pushback over the years and people even just saying, who do you think you are? Well, I'm thankful that you didn't let that stop you or anybody else that you get a chance to work with, because this is an important topic and we need to keep on digging to get to the truth of the matter. So thank you for your work in that space.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me on, Dhru.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
Whatever we choose to put on our dinner plate, our human bodies will absorb the nutrients in the upper part of the digestive system. And then anything that we don't absorb gets sent downstairs. Our bacteria get the leftovers.